Church. And tonight we are pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with Physicians for Social Responsibility. I think most people in this room know that Physicians for Social Responsibility has a very long and distinguished record of campaigning to rid the world of the menace of nuclear weapons. And among other things, has been a co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. This evening we're fortunate to have with us a member of the National Board of Directors of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Alfred Martin, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. Alfred?
Thank you, Guy. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight, and I hope that you will be well informed and inspired by the program this evening. I want to thank Guy Quinlan and the All Souls Nuclear Disarmament Task Force, the War Resisters League, and the Progressive Foundation for co-sponsoring this event, along with Physicians for Social Responsibility. As Guy mentioned, PSR has long been involved in the health impacts from radioactive fallout, first with supporting the partial nuclear test ban treaty in 1963, the Nobel Prize work in the 80s for reduction of nuclear weapons that Guy mentioned. From that work, we determined that prevention really is the only treatment for nuclear Armageddon. There is no medical response possible to the use of nuclear weapons. In fact, our current work shows that even a limited nuclear conflagration, such as a war between India and Pakistan, would cause a decade or more of climate change and reduced food production that would threaten 2 B as in boy billion people with death. So this is an alarming topic, being concerned about nuclear weapons, nuclear power, and nuclear waste. It's one more terrible thing to be concerned about, and in particular because it has the potential to change the face of life on Earth. And we live in a time of issue overload and psychic numbing, which are understandable reactions to such formidable problems, but having those conditions do nothing to address the threats to life on Earth and our human existence. This picture shows, it's at the White House. Far right is our speaker tonight, who it's my pleasure to introduce to you, John LaForge. He's a regular contributor to Counterpunch. Since 1992, he's been on the staff of Nuke Watch, a nonprofit located in Luck, Wisconsin. He's co-director and editor of the Nuke Watch quarterly newsletter, which is just distributed to 2,300 people. John has written widely about nuclear power and weapons and has testified before British and Dutch parliamentarians on the unlawfulness of depleted uranium weapons used widely by the U.S. He and Barb Catt visited all 1,000 land-based missiles in 1988 to document their locations for the original edition of Nuclear Heartland. The revised edition is what John will speak about tonight. And lastly, I just want to point out that John is both an Eagle Scout and a convicted felon. And he hopes that he can change your ideas about both. John LaForge.
Thank you very much, Alfred. And Guy and All Souls for hosting our event tonight. It's a pleasure to be here in New York City. I've been away from home 3 weeks now speaking about the book, and it's a great pleasure to be in the Big Apple finally. The reason we brought out the revised edition of Nuclear Heartland is to promote the permanent retirement of our land-based missiles. The 450 you can see in the banner to your left, which remain in the Great Plains of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, and Colorado. Did I say Colorado? We must remind the public that 450 ICBMs are still on alert status 27 years after the end of the Cold War. They are redundant, they are too powerful to use, they are abysmal failures at the mission they claim to conduct, they are accident-prone and corruption-ridden. They produce only a very few jobs, votes, and some campaign funds for their supporters, along with the grueling fear and fearsome radioactive wastes. The missile field maps that Newquartz disclosed in 1988 with publication of the first edition, or the original Nuclear Heartland, shocked the general public by revealing revealing in graphic detail the mostly unknown size of the land-based nuclear arsenal. This map of the High Plains missile field in the corner of Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado holds 150 missiles, 10 in each of the little blocked out departments there by red lines. There's also one launch control center for each of the 10 missiles. So there are 15 launch control centers in each of these missile fields, 3 of which are still maintained by the U.S. Air Force. Missileers, as they call themselves, work in these launch control centers on 3-day shifts, practicing, training, and trying always to be on alert for a presidential launch order that we hope, and they hope, never comes. The missiles almost surround the city of Minot, North Dakota, which, by the way, happens to be ground zero of gas fracking right now, which involves wells and hundreds of drilling projects right in this missile field. I recommend a half-hour program by Rachel Maddow that you can watch online, where she went into great detail about the risks posed not just by the missiles themselves in their alert status, but in conjunction with this gas fracking bonanza. There's a missile field in Montana, of course, near the Front Range of the Rockies. And in particular, Nuclear Heartland, the original, highlighted the nearness of these land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles to homes like this one in Montana, their nearness to schools like this elementary playground in Wyoming, the nearness to farms all across the Great Plains. And we also, with the publication of the maps, were able to illustrate the surprising approachability and the unguarded vulnerability of these horrendous weapons. In Wyoming, this silo was left wide open all weekend for some maintenance work, forcing us to ask, what about the Soviet threat? Well, back in 1988, there were 6 of these giant missile fields, and 1,000 Minuteman missiles in total. Each of them carried a megaton warhead, along with sometimes with 2 other warheads, 1.2 million tons of TNT on each of 1,000 missiles. Half of those have been removed since that time, thanks to the START II and START I reduction treaties, and also, I would say, in part a result of hundreds of protests that took place in these areas as a result of the publication of the book. Barb Catt and I are probably the only 2 people to have ever visited all 1,000 Minuteman missile sites and their 100 launch control centers. We spent 4 months and drove 30,000 miles verifying the exact locations of these missiles for the original book, which still is the only complete atlas of the government's ground-based Another example here of how vulnerable these sites are, so remotely located, unguarded, fenced by a thin hurricane fence and a little barbed wire. And the launch control security forces are so many miles away that we climbed the fences, took photographs many, many times, and simply drove off. Like high schoolers told us they did during our research. For a Friday evening prank, they'd sometimes drive out, rattle the fence, and then run off and hide in the grass for a while, watch the security come out to find out what was going on. And so they would then be able to have a laugh at the expense of the Air Force. Well, beginning in 1962, as I said, 2 or 3 warheads were put on each missile. On the left of this photo are the re-entry vehicles, inside of which are the warheads. The re-entry vehicles are made of highly engineered graphite material so that they can leave and then re-enter the atmosphere as they travel up to 8,000 miles over the North Pole. The destructive magnitude of the 1,000 missiles that used to dot the plains amounted to about 53,000 Hiroshima bombs, the consequences of which are depicted here. That crude device killed roughly 140,000 people and incinerated this 7 square miles. Today, the remaining 450 Minuteman IIIs each carry a single 300 kiloton warhead, 20 times the force of the Hiroshima bomb, each of which could potentially destroy 51 square miles. Roughly, think of Pittsburgh or Minneapolis or Dayton or Galveston. Each one could destroy roughly 2.8 million people, all else being equal with the Hiroshima weapon. Chicago, for example, has 2.6 million people. These devices are not just bigger bombs, as we know. They blind people 50 miles away from ground zero. They detonate at 1,000,000 degrees Fahrenheit. They produce countless generations of genetic and biological damage. The incomprehensible mass destruction of nuclear weapons is so overwhelming that working directly with them requires a chronic sort of psychic numbing that Alfred mentioned earlier, and is also at the same time an optimistic myth-making. These weapons are believed to have power and influence that is not real. They are artificially imbued with ethical value and a practical purpose that allows corporate and military workers to continue preparing deliberately for attacks that are indiscriminate, uncontrollable, and unlawful. This is a Boeing employee doing a little maintenance on one of the ready-to-launch Minuteman IIIs. Nuclear myth-making was on full display during what was called a ceremony marking the removal of the last missile from the Grand Forks, North Dakota missile field in June of 1998. The base commander there, Colonel Ed Rausch, said ICBMs stood as a deterrent to any adversary that might consider challenging the peace and freedom that we enjoy. Although his claim is considered common knowledge by the culture at large, it is factually preposterous as it ignores hundreds of undeterred attacks on our peace and freedom. To name just a few, the 1968 Tet Offensive, the 1970 hijacking of an Eastern Airlines flight, the 1979 Iran hostage crisis, the 1983 Marine Barracks bombing, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, the October 2000 bombing of the USS Cole, and dozens more. Nuclear deterrence, so-called, although it's been replaced with first strike nuclear weapons and repeatedly refuted by attacks on U.S. targets, is still the principal rationale for the nuclear arsenal. Deterrence theory is simultaneously both so easily debunked and so firmly believed in that it recalls Mark Twain's dictum. He said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." Colonel Rausch repeated another principal myth of the nuclear age. He said, "Because of the ever-present missiles on alert, we won the Cold War." But no one won the Cold War, and there are tens of thousands of losers and fatalities even in our own country. The United States spent over $4 trillion on nuclear weapons between 1945 and 1995, yet most of the 70,000 warheads produced have been eliminated. Last December 11th, McClatchy News, the third largest news service in the United States, published a year-long investigation reporting that 33,000 nuclear weapons workers have died of cancers caused by their workplace exposures to radiation. Some 16,000 U.S. citizens were used without their consent in human radiation experiments documented in the 1990s. Those victims might question whether the Cold War was won by them. Some 250,000 soldiers were marched into radiation fallout zones during hot war games in the desert. According to a 1997 report by the National Institutes of Health, radioactive fallout from open-air bomb tests gave thyroid cancer to up to 75,000 U.S. citizens, and 15% of those cancers were fatal. U.S. territory has been pocked with large radioactive sacrifice areas that will never be cleaned and known in the movement as sacrifice zones. These names will be familiar with most of you, of course. The Nevada test site, the Hanford Reservation in Washington State, the Savannah River site in South Carolina, and the permanently depopulated Marshall Islands in the Pacific, poisoned by 67 above-ground bomb tests. A brand new documentary titled Nuclear Savage reviews the treatment of the Marshallese Islanders, of people who might argue with Colonel Rausch about having won the war. Of course, since Nuclear Heartland first appeared, nonviolent resistance to the missile system has taken many forms in hundreds of places, from silent vigils to mass encirclement, silo occupations, even jackhammer disarmament. Much of the civil resistance at the missile silos and launch control centers was conducted to bring critical media attention to the weapons, which are otherwise ignored. As with other nuclear weapon systems, the press does not generally report on ICBMs unless there is an individual or a group openly demonstrating opposition and risking being carted off to jail. The only other time these sites seem to make news headlines is when there's an accident or a near accident, and there has been a long series of them in the missile fields, chronicled most recently and thoroughly by Eric Schlosser in his book Command and Control. In 2010, 1984, Air Force emergency response teams parked an armored vehicle on the lid of a silo in a last-ditch effort to prevent what appeared to be the launch of its underground malfunctioning missile. The incident was not reported at the time. 4 years later, it was discovered by a reporter for Casper, Wyoming's Star Tribune. When this report was finally published, Catherine Collins was called at the paper and told by retired missileers, as they call themselves, "Oh, that happens all the time." This missile was giving signals back to the launch control center that it was undergoing a sequence, a launch sequence, that is. More recently, incident that happened in May of 2014 and reported just this January 2015, a mishap at one of the missiles in the F.E. Warren Air Force Base involved a repair crew going out to do some regular maintenance and then having caused additional damage to the missile, which was removed from the silos, shipped off to Hill Air Force Base in Utah for repairs. It cost the Air Force approximately $1.8 million to repair, although the damage was not reported by the Air Force. It wasn't disclosed. The extent or the nature of the damage is being kept secret even from an Air Force investigative team that was in the area at the time investigating a separate scandal in the missile field. In January 2014, 2 missile launch crew administrators at Malmstrom Air Force Base were accused of operating an illegal narcotics distribution system across 6 different Air Force bases. The general who signed the report on this investigation mentioned specific illegal drug use, including synthetic drugs, ecstasy, and amphetamines. General Holmes's investigation led to the discovery of an entirely separate scandal, widespread cheating on proficiency exams among the missileers, the people in charge of launching the missiles on the president's order. Again, by late January 2014, a total of 92 missileers from Malmstrom were suspended and decertified, barred from their launch duty after cheating on their exams. The reports that were extensive in the New York Times mentioned the extreme pressure these Air Force personnel are under to get a perfect score on these examinations. This is highly sensitive operations. These are the most sensitive operations you can imagine, being prepared to launch these enormous systems. And so no mistakes are allowed. And they're under such enormous pressure that having gotten a hold of the answers and being expected to get A+ over and over, these personnel were texting the answers to one another with their cell phones. And who can blame them? The pressure is so enormous there. And getting a less than perfect score means either a demotion or perhaps an end to your promotion in the service and to your possible advancement in your career. Well, the cell phones were confiscated and missileers were retrained and reassigned, so they're back at work. But 9 full colonels and lieutenant colonels at Malmstrom Base, nearly the entire chain of command there, was removed from duty over their failure to detect the widespread cheating. High-level calls for the elimination of these ICBMs are partly the result of these scandals, and they come from influential military and civilian experts who have recently called the missile system completely expendable. In 2010, 3 high-ranking officials, including an Air Force colonel who worked directly for the Secretary of Air Force, suggested that the U.S. should unilaterally cut its nuclear arsenal by over 90% to a total of 311 nuclear weapons. Colonel Chance Saltzman, chief of the U.S. Air Force's Strategic Plans and Policy Division, said no more than 311 were useful in the nuclear force structure. And even more authoritative criticism came in 2012 from this individual, General James Cartwright, a former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who chaired an extensive study that concluded the U.S. no longer needed warheads deployed on ICBMs at all. Cartwright's report was signed by Senator Chuck Hagel, who would later become Secretary of Defense, and during his Senate confirmation hearings would have to defend his position, calling for the elimination of these ICBMs. At the Senate hearing, also testified to by General Cartwright, the general said no sensible argument has been put forward for using nuclear weapons to solve any of the major 21st century problems that we face. In fact, nuclear weapons have become, on balance, arguably more of a part of the problem than any solution. During his confirmation hearings, Chuck Hagel was harassed or pulled apart by what we call the Doomsday Coalition or the Doomsday Lobby. They call themselves the ICBM Coalition, 10 U.S. senators from these missile states who bend over backwards defending the retention of this arsenal. More on that in a little bit. As a sort of exclamation point to our new revised edition, and only 3 weeks after we published it, last December 3rd, former Secretary of Defense William J. Perry declared ICBMs aren't necessary, they're not needed. Of course, he's headed the Pentagon under Bill Clinton and called for, since retiring, the complete elimination of land-based ICBMs. Speaking to journalists, he said, any reasonable definition of a deterrence will not require ICBMs. And he goes on to explain that they're simply too easy to launch on bad information in view of all the accidents or near accidents that have been recorded. He also says they are, quote, the most likely source of an accidental nuclear war. He referred to them as destabilizing, partly, we would say, because they are so sophisticated and accurate that they are first strike weapons, which adds to the destabilization of other states armed with nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Of course, Mr. Perry, too, was criticized severely by the weapons lobby, the ICBM coalition, but he has stuck to his position on his website. He says this, nuclear weapons no longer provide for our security, they endanger it. Well, leading the way in this nuclear retirement syndrome, as the author Yale psychologist Robert Lifton put it, the nuclear retirement syndromes, is Mr. Paul Nitze, the late Paul Nitze, a former Reagan White House advisor and lifelong Cold War anti-Soviet hardliner. Upon retirement, he wrote in the New York Times, I see no compelling reason why we should not unilaterally get rid of our nuclear weapons. To maintain them adds nothing to our security. He even said, I can think of no circumstances under which it'd be wise for the U.S. to use nuclear weapons, even in retaliation for their prior use against us. This should be the epitaph for the nuclear arsenal. And coming from a lifelong anti-Soviet activist, it's a spectacular denunciation of deterrence theory and the arsenal as a whole. Nevertheless, these voices of reason are up against the self-styled ICBM coalition I've mentioned, a group of 10 senators working to stop further reductions in the nuclear arsenal, as they say, to protect jobs, Air Force bases. What they don't mention are that they protect also votes and campaign contributions in their states. In 2012, a Russian proposal to cut the current 1,950 active warheads that are now on launchers to 1,550, cut the total by 400 weapons, was halted by Montana Senators Tester and then Baucus. Baucus subsequently having been replaced by Steve Daines in Montana. These senators complained that the cut of 400 would have meant the likely closing of their Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls. Bill Hartung, with the Center of Responsive Politics, reported in 2012 that these 10 senators got $513,000 from the 4 largest missile contractors listed in an earlier slide: General Electric, Northrop Grumman, Boeing Corporation, and United Technologies. These are the senators who are the chief movers behind efforts to replace the entire Minuteman system with a brand new land-based ICBM. and maintaining the arsenal in perpetuity. Please help see these vested interests exposed and defeated in their work to save the ICBMs. If we increase their exposure and amplify the volume of our demands, we can see these dinosaurs of the Cold War retired in a matter of years, saving billions and eliminating what Paul Nietzsche called the threat to ourselves. Now, thank you very much.
Any way that this can become an issue in the elections? Like, are you going to go be a convicted felon again?
Nuclear weapons are the first thing people want to put out of their minds, and the same goes for the media. And in an election year, it is really no different, is it? It's very hard to get the media to pay attention to issues, even those ones being raised in the campaign.
Sally Jones. I have a question on this is a strategy, an old strategy to have these ICBM network of missile sites. So it seems to me that it should be the military's decision to decommission them or de-alert them, not a group of 10 senators, since it's a military decision. So on what grounds can Congress affect a military strategy that the military itself may not want?
It's a good point being made that the elimination of these missiles based on whether they're needed or not, or redundant or useless, is fundamentally a military decision. And so why is it that 10 U.S. senators have so much power over the retention of this part of the nuclear arsenal? Well, I would give, I believe, a two-part answer, because fundamentally, at least nominally, civilians are supposed to be directing what the military does in the United States. And that goes for nuclear weapons as well as conventional weapons. And so the U.S. Senate and the House, being in charge of military appropriations bills and what gets funded and what doesn't, I do believe they're the proper authority to decide. That's in part why, I'd say secondly, I've made a point of finding and highlighting these military and civilian officials, high-ranking officials, who have come out and directed the public and the military to get rid of these dinosaurs, as I call them. I think that the people in the military do know this, that they can't be used lawfully or practically, that they're harmful to ourselves by bringing threats of attacks on us, but they are silenced by active duty pledges not to speak out. Most of these statements have come from retired military and civilian officials. Well, that's why Lifton called it a syndrome. I do believe, however, that their voices do need to be respected and amplified so that we can bring pressure against these senators and as well as congressional representatives who just like the contracts bringing money back into their home districts. And it does involve tens of billions of dollars. And so there's a big financial interest in maintaining these systems in spite of their uselessness.
They could spend exactly the same amount of money in the appropriations and de-alert them, and just have the same people go around checking to make sure they're de-alerted. So that could be like a first step. If the president is the commander-in-chief, it seems to me, just rational decision would be to de-alert and then work on the money next with a presidential executive order.
The point was that the money used to maintain and polish and house and clothe and feed these weapons could be spent seeing them de-alerted, seeing the weapons warheads separated from the launch vehicles, and seeing them ultimately and permanently decommissioned. I spoke with another aspect of the vested interest here, missile design engineer at Livermore National Lab one time and asked him that precise question. With all your expertise, wouldn't it be better spent figuring out a way to containerize radioactive waste and keep it out of the biosphere than to produce new weapons? And he wouldn't take me seriously at all. His answer was burned into my consciousness. He said, "We like to cook, we don't like to do the dishes." So that's another part of the problem that we're up against. The vested interest in missile design, engineering, and development in the national laboratories involves highly prestigious positions, highly paid positions that would come to an end if this system is defunded.
When we see the enormous numbers that we're talking about, it's not just 2 or 3 nuclear weapons which can wipe out New York. We're in the thousands. And when we look at a map of where they are in this country, and I would ask that we would see what a map in Russia looks like, and what a map of nuclear-held weapon countries like France and England would look like, it seems beyond imagination how we could survive even a modest accident. So the question I have for myself, and I'll pose it to others here, is whether anybody's doing, for instance, studies. What are the percentage chances that over the next 10 years, only 2 nuclear detonations will occur over a major city anywhere in the world? And that somebody is willing to step up and say, I'll say it's at 50%. And somebody else will say, no, I say it's at 20%. But go through a whole array of percentages to demonstrate the outrageous situation society is for even having this discussion today. And that kind of talk, bringing it into a harsh reality and not disguising it by this is a wonderful study, beautifully documented, but it's full of terror if you start asking the questions I'm asking.
I'm not aware of studies to that effect. The question was, are there studies underway or that have been published on the probability of the use of these weapons, even 1 or 2 warheads?
Yes.
One of our audience members is.
John Burroughs from Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. There's a Stanford professor who has done studies in this general area. Does anybody remember his name off the top? But there's something very simple you can do, is just say, assume a very low percentage. If you have a low percentage over a long period of time, the event will happen. So that's one approach that is taken. So John, did you say you and your partner visited 1,000 silos?
Yes.
Wow, that's amazing. And I came in a little bit late. Did you mention that you've spent time in prison?
Well, Alfred introduced me as a felon, but I didn't go into any detail about that.
Well, maybe you could say something about that, because I think we get overwhelmed with the facts and figures and the so-called strategy, and it's important, the personal stories. There are very good reasons not to have, even within sort of nuclear orthodoxy, there are very good reasons not to have land-based missiles as opposed to submarine-based missiles or bombers. And that's partly what William Perry is talking about. But one thing that's happened is that Markey and his colleagues who have been pressing for spending cuts have been talking about spending cuts on the bombers and the submarines because there's bigger money to be saved there than there is on the ICBMs. It's problematic. I remember Guy Quinlan and I, were raising this question with a Markey staffer. No real answer came back. You probably are aware that when the missiles, the ICBMs were being challenged, 2-3 years ago, an Air Force general said, we like to have them on our soil because the enemy knows we will hit back if they strike us on our soil. Now, how's that for a rationale for land-based ICBMs?
Well, John asked me to say something about the the protesting and the jail going, it has been a big part of my life. I mean, having visited 1,000 silos, it took most of a winter, 3 months, by car. It made an enormous impact on our psyches. And we subsequently proceeded to organize and participate in a lot of demonstrations against the missile silos nearest to us, which happened to be the Grand Forks Missile Field, which is now one of those eliminated. And we also went to Strategic Air Command, which in Omaha, Nebraska, controls the entire arsenal in conjunction with Global Strike Command in Barksdale, Louisiana, the large Air Force base there. We concluded after a lot of research that regular constitutional means of addressing the problem of nuclear weapons has or had been exhausted, and therefore we were justified in launching ourselves into a lot of civil disobedience, nonviolent civil resistance, we call it, in order to bring attention to the weapons and make our case in court. I believe I've spent an entire college career on the inside of various jails and prison camps, about 4.5 years. So it's a lot of good reading time. I recommend it for all Caucasians in this country. It's very important to see the inside of a cell, and your mystification about it, your disinformation about it falls away immediately, and you make friends like that, because minority populations make up the majority in the jail, and they are the first ones to understand exactly why we are there. Whereas my experience with Caucasians in jail is they don't get it, and they're flag-waving patriots and gunslinging bandits who like violence. So it's a good education, and we should all try it. It's interesting that you point out, John, that it's easier to save money with submarine missiles and the bombers than it is with the land-based missiles. The system is so complicated. These are the most easily gotten rid of, the most easily made fun of, and the most easily scandalized by malfeasance and corruption. And yet, some of the hardest to get rid of. Although it's quite obvious we don't need them. There used to be 1,000 that we said, that the government said were needed. Of course, that was untrue. Getting 450 more eliminated shouldn't be that difficult if we were unified and amplified our demands.
I just wanted to add to John Burroughs' point about the contact with Markey's staff. Coincidentally, earlier today, a few hours ago, I was speaking with one of Senator Markey's national security advisors by phone. Recently, John LaForge, the speaker, has mentioned this briefly about the data indicating that catastrophic climate change would follow even a modest nuclear exchange. Last month, the Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy sent several U.S. senators, including Markey, a letter urging him to offer an amendment to the Defense Appropriations Bill mandating a National Academy of Sciences study about the climate effects of nuclear war. And in speaking to the aide today, I mentioned, speaking about land-based missiles, that one of the arguments that the Air Force is currently making for them, believe it or not, is that the more precise guidance systems from the new missiles would reduce or minimize civilian casualties if deterrence fails, which is a grotesque idea. But one point to underscore is that although the people talk about deterrence as a rationale, many of these new nuclear weapons programs are being pushed as for nuclear warfighting capacity, not for deterrence. And it is insane now as it ever was to assume that you can control nuclear escalation or that a nuclear war could be controlled. Also, John LaForge mentioned that the devastating effects that even a modest nuclear war between India and Pakistan, for example, would have. Physicians for Social Responsibility has a very good, concise study about this with charts and diagrams, a very effective presentation called Nuclear Famine, 2 billion people at risk. And you can get this through the PSR website, psr.org.
In the fall, I believe, the Union of Concerned Scientists were here. And there was a remark made that Obama could, by executive order, close these missile sites down. Their point of view at the time was, instead of protesting in the streets, we should be applying pressure directly on Obama about it. And I was remarking that, well, within political reality, he might not be able to, where he could actually, in fact, close them down by executive order, because we live in a democracy that's controlled by money, the long-term consequences could be not the same as intended by closing them down by fiat. So I'm interested in your remarks you might make on that. And I also would like to just point out, you said these 10 senators received around $517,000 in campaign contributions. Huh?
513,000, right?
Right. And, compared to the huge expense it's causing to our country, we are, boy, those votes were sure damn cheap. That's all I can say.
About your first point, whether the president could, by executive order, just de-alert and decommission these missiles, I do believe that's legally possible. And I really appreciate a precedent by George Herbert Walker Bush that proves this point. When George Bush the elder was president, he removed nuclear weapons from surface ships in the Navy unilaterally, and almost immediately the Soviet Union responded in kind, just based on the goodwill gesture. That's a terrific precedent. I think it could be followed with great success. In this case, any president could do it. Of course, as you point out, they're under a great pressure from the Congress and from military contractors who pay for the Congress to maintain the status quo. Personally, I'm not a fan of lobbying the president for anything, so I'm not sure about your first point being made by Union of Concerned Scientists. Well, the idea of lobbying the White House might be more effective than protesting in the street. Of course, we could debate that endlessly forever. Of course, all these things are important to do. That's why we circulate a petition for Congress the same time we organize a sit-down in front of the Launch Control Center. I think everything has its merit, and everything helps bring more attention to these systems. Some things a little more directly than others.
You hear a lot about the old technology used in these sites, floppy disks and things like that. Could you, elaborate a little bit?
Yes, 60 Minutes did a report, I think 2 years ago, 2014, about the launch control centers and the archaic systems they use to be safe from cyber attacks. And so they literally use those old 6-inch floppy disks that we haven't seen in our lives for 25 years, right? 20 years anyway. But that's because they can't be hacked, and they're actually more secure that way, even though it seems counterintuitive to be using such an outdated system.
Peter Weiss, also from the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. In reading Secretary Perry's book, you get the impression that he's really obsessed with the absolute urgency of getting rid not only of ICBMs, but of all nuclear weapons. And that he has been for almost his entire 60, 70-year career. So my question to you is, do you have a sense of what he is prepared to do or might be prepared to do if he gets support from civil society to awaken people to the urgency of getting rid of nuclear weapons before one of these things goes off and kills a few 100 million people?
What former Secretary Perry is prepared to do to make his case and defend it for the elimination of all these weapons. And his website, the William J. Perry Project, is pretty bold in its statements. It doesn't indicate to me an answer to your question. I'm sorry, I'm not sure the extent to which he's willing to go. Obviously, he is quite alarmed by the current state of the arsenal. He must be seriously terrified by statements by Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, who talk about using nuclear weapons against terrorist groups in Syria, obviously not knowing anything about the subject at all. But I think your question is very important. We should find out exactly how far he's willing to go and encourage him and get on board with his message, or encourage him to get on board with ours. He has gone way overboard for a former Secretary of Defense. There aren't many who have made statements as strong as he has. I think of General George Lee Butler, who was in command of the Minuteman system and in charge of Strategic Air Command. And he too has the credibility to undo this entire system and has made speech after speech calling for the same thing. But it is hard for these retired officials to get traction. So your question is very good. And thank you for coming.
A couple of comments and then also ask a question to the speaker. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. There are petitions on the back table if you'd like to sign that, calling for the drawdown of these missiles. And there will be a book signing afterwards, and also time to talk privately with John LaForge if you'd like to. The question I wanted to bring to the discussion is to get your comments, John, on the work done by people such as Arjun Makhijani about the fact that even if nuclear weapons are never ever used, if somehow we can dodge the bullet of there being an accident or mistaken communication or outright hostilities, if somehow they never are used again, that just to possess them dramatically harms the country which has them. And I would point out that we are faced in this country with horrendous radiological pollution in the Hanford site in Washington State, in the Savannah River site in South Carolina and Georgia, the Snake River aquifer in Idaho is gravely threatened. There are these plumes of radioactive materials that we know not what to do with. And we're not talking just about the highly irradiated spent nuclear fuel in reactors. Nuclear reactors were conceived of, designed, built, and operated first and foremost to make the materials for bombs. But it's not just that. It's the whole pollution and the number of workers who are damaged. And even if they aren't used, they're a very, very damaging weapon to possess.
Alfred mentioned Arjun Makhijani, the president of the Institute for Environmental and Energy Research in Tacoma Park, Maryland. He's written a dozen books on the subject of nuclear weapons and the environmental fallout of producing and maintaining them. His magnum opus on this subject I highly recommend. It's called Nuclear Wastelands. It looks, in answer to an earlier question, not just at the U.S. nuclear arsenal and its environmental consequences, but that of Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and the other powers. It's a magnificent study, MIT Press. And yeah, the point is well taken. An earlier philosopher said these weapons kill even without being used by forcing people to starve. The resources spent on them are stolen from aid programs, of course, but they also kill people without being used by having polluted the aquifers in major drinking water systems in the United States. The Hanford Reservation leaks directly to the Columbia watershed, and the Columbia River is drinking water for Portland, Oregon, and other downstream cities. Major long-term consequences that we will suffer and endure even if these weapons aren't detonated or accidentally launched. Another reason why we need to address the cleanup problem with the funds that are being used now to maintain and possibly even enlarge the nuclear arsenal.
Thank you very much.